Canberra Chess Club Club Championship 2022, Round 8. Swallowed by a whale. I took a loss in this game, a hard pill to swallow. But I learned much from my top-of-the-table clash against one of the juggernauts of Canberran chess. And in my next endeavours, and the success that will come with them, the experience of this game will prove to have been one of the more formative moments. I played as black, and my opponent opened with knight f3. What's notable about this move is that he thought about it for 5 minutes before playing it. Now, we've come to know each other through the chess club, and he knows that when I'm black, I play e5 against e4, and I play knight f6 against d4. I figure he wanted to play something out of the ordinary, neither e4 nor d4, nor c4, but something different altogether. I didn't think it was too strange that he spent a few minutes on this decision. In hindsight, however, I think this seasoned competition winner and reigning champion was drawing on his experience to use a psychological meta strategy on top of any objective chess strategy, wherein from the first move he would dangle himself out there, appearing vulnerable on the clock, and bait me into playing quickly. I responded with d5, and once again he went into another apparently deep think. 4 minutes later, he played the natural move d4, and I was already hooked. I thought, I've got an extra 9 minutes on the clock compared to him. I'm going to continue to play with rapid moves and put him under pressure on the clock. I played c5, unsure of exactly how I would regain the pawn if he played d takes c5, but confident there would be a way, or I would have compensation in other forms. But he played e3 instead. It should be noted here that I am well aware that the proper pawn structure for me in this kind of position involves, most likely, playing e6 at some point. The downside, in my mind, of playing e6 is that it blocks in my light-squared bishop. Therefore, I decided to get my light-squared bishop out now, and only later, once the bishop is out and mobile, would I close the gate with e6. I didn't necessarily think that bishop g4 was the best move, or that the pin I was creating was very dangerous for my opponent, but it was a quick move to play, which I thought couldn't possibly be too bad. And I also had a very anti-positional, aggressive, and ultimately unsound plan to follow it up with. So I played it, bishop g4. Here, my opponent played d takes c5, snatching that pawn that I was offering. My anti-positional plan was to follow up with e5, staking out a greater share of the center than I was truly entitled to, and going against the more traditional and positional and sound plans associated with the more restricted and restrained e6. I once again was moving on the basis that this would create a dangerous and chaotic situation on the board, which he would have to deal with far less time than me. In playing e5, I was threatening bishop takes c5, and also threatening e4, which attacks his pinned knight. Only later, when thinking on his time, I realized that e4 is not that great a threat because he can respond with h3, counter-attacking my bishop. Nevertheless, the game was now in motion and the fight was well and truly on. At this stage, I will either win in a flurry or go down in tremendous flames. The best move here for white is c4, which attacks my overextended centre. But my opponent played h3 instead. I had only ever really developed my bishop to prevent it from getting trapped behind e6. I didn't have any other great plan for it. So here I traded it for the knight, and he recaptured with his queen. And to end the sequence, I developed my bishop out to c5, where it regathered my previously captured pawn. Here he played queen g4, and I was feeling great. Although I had played an anti-positional and dubious way, I was ahead on the clock by almost 40 minutes, and I was developing my pieces nicely, whereas he only had his queen out. I saw, of course, that from g4, his queen attacks my g7 pawn, but I also realized that I was prepared to sacrifice that pawn for the sake of further developing my pieces. I thought that if I do continue bringing out my pieces, and he brings his queen that far into my territory, I may end up surrounding and ultimately trapping and winning his queen. So I played knight f6, attacking his queen and inviting the move he played. Queen takes g7. I responded with rook g8, forcing his queen onto its only remaining safe square, h6. Now, I'm not only ahead on the clock, but I am objectively better. My plan for aggression continued here, and I played knight c6. Just look at this position. I have two central pawns, a nice bishop, two nice knights, and a rook on a semi-open file. And all he has, in addition to one extra measly pawn, is his queen. He told me after the game that in this position he was trembling. He felt that he was just about to become swallowed by a whale. And I agree. I really like my position here. It's full of threats that he must avoid. The game continued with g4, and here the computer says that black is much, much better. But I failed to slow down and use my extra time to clearly and objectively think about the best continuations. Instead, I just clung to the notion of playing solid moves quickly, trying to beat him on the clock rather than on the board. I knew I wanted to castle, and to do that, I needed to move my queen out of the way. I decided on queen e7, which puts my queen in the same line as his king, and may help to create threats in the future. He played bishop b5, pinning my knight, and I castled long. I'm still considerably better in this position and far ahead on the clock. I'm feeling confident that I'm going to win this game and ultimately take what I feel is my rightful place as the Canberra Chess Club champion. But here, he played g5. I thought for a while on this move. I really did. My first instinct, which turned out to be correct, was to play knight e4. I then realized that if I do this, he would be able to take twice on c6 with check, and that scared me initially. I later thought this might still be okay, but in the meantime I considered other options. I thought maybe after he takes for the first time on c6, I could insert rook d6, attacking his queen and then coming back to pick up the bishop, and that would have been okay. But in the end I played rook g6, attacking his queen immediately. I saw that if he takes my knight, he would also be counter-attacking my queen, and that would be bad for me. But I calculated that if I recapture with my queen, then, as prophesied long ago, his queen would become trapped. If, say, he takes on queen h7, then rook h8 leaves his queen with nothing better but to take my rook, which I then recapture his queen. So therefore I went for it. I went for rook g6. He then took my knight, and I, thinking he had made a terrible blunder under pressure, recaptured with my queen, truly thinking I was about to trap his queen. The detail I missed though was that in taking my knight, he also freed up the h5 square for his queen. So he was not forced to play queen takes h7 as I had thought. And after queen h5, I've simply lost a knight for a pawn. And that is in addition to the pawn I gave up on g7. I did feel disappointment kicking in at this stage, but drawing on prior experience, I did not lose hope. I made space in my mind for the fact that, of course, I will make mistakes, and I moved on. However, once again, I moved on too quickly. I played d4, trying to open the center and have my remaining pieces threaten his still centralized king. The obvious downsides to d4 are that it closes off my bishop and closes the diagonal from my queen. And it allows him to keep the center closed by playing e4, which essentially puts the nail in my coffin. I could have just resigned here, but I couldn't bring myself to give up on the dream of winning this club championship, and hence I played on, trying to be aggressive and open the center. I pushed forward with d3. Here, my opponent checked me and forced a trade of queens, which diminished my firepower and also got rid of any possibility of me trapping his queen. So he's not just ahead with lots of extra material, but my attacking resources are now also all but gone. Sure, he was down to 5 minutes left on the clock, and I still had an hour, but those 5 minutes were more than enough for him from this position. We traded queens and I continued trying to put pressure on him. I played rook g2, attacking his f2 pawn. He took my d3 pawn. I played e4 in desperation, but he didn't take any chances. He just retreated his now overwhelming defensive resources with bishop e2. On knight d4, he played bishop e3, and I took c2 with check. He moved his king over to attack my rook, and I took his bishop with check, which also protects my rook. And after he recaptured, I was still thinking of ways to checkmate him. I thought about the line bishop takes e3, he takes my rook, I check him with my remaining rook, he steps to h2, and that allows me to play bishop f4 checkmate. But there are lots of ways for him to defend. For instance, after bishop takes e3, king takes rook, my other rook gives him a check. He can just move the king back to f1 and I've got nothing. So instead, I retreated my attacked rook and put it on a square where it attacked his e3 pawn. Now he just focused on developing the rest of his pieces. He played knight to c3, which attacks my e5 pawn and threatens to fork my bishop and rook. So I played rook g5, and after he took on e5, I took on f5 with check, thereby defending my bishop. He played king e1. Had he not played king e1, I was again still looking for checkmates, like if king g2, rook g8 check, rook f2 check, and then if knight takes f2, which is forced, bishop d6 would be checkmate. But once again, these lines all depend on him making a series of unnecessary mistakes, and in truth he has defenses to them all. As played on king e1, I played bishop b4, which incidentally would also have been checkmate if it weren't for his knight. He played knight c3. I went rook e5 to attack his pawn. He played king f2 to defend it. And you can see that no matter what I try, he has defenses to everything. I took his knight to weaken his pawn structure. My only remaining goal was to trade off all the pawns and rooks and leave him with nothing but a king and a bishop, which is insufficient to give a checkmate, and therefore the resultant game would be a stalemate and a draw. But even this was far too ambitious and hopeful to be realistic. After he recaptured my bishop, I doubled my rooks and he played rook h e1. This prevents me from taking on e3, because if I do, he moves his bishop away with check, thereby uncovering a strong attack against my rooks. To prevent this, I played f5, which takes the g4 square away from his bishop, but he then just played bishop f3. I advance my king to c7 and he plays rook b1, bringing extra pressure to that pawn, which I therefore pushed. After rook b4, I played king d6, continuing to centralize my king. He responded with rook c4, I played rook c5, and then he finished with rook d1 check. Here I have to move my king away, and then he's going to take my rook, ruin my pawn structure, and then just continue to dominate me with all of his extra material, despite his low amount of time on the clock. And so, accepting the reality of my situation, reluctantly, I resigned. I shook his hand and we sat down to analyze the game together afterwards, which I appreciated, but I was of course very disappointed. On reflection, I think that I did well. I had the reigning champion on the ropes. Better, both on the board and on the clock. But I got overexcited, and in my inexperience, I started playing clock instead of chess. Ultimately, the thing that lost the game for me was not any great move from him, but rather it was my own oversight. I simply blundered that his queen had the retreat square on h5. I handed this to him on a silver platter. I was beaten by the champ, of course, but in reality, I beat myself. He didn't outplay me as much as I underplayed myself. In any case, I have learned from this game. I learned that there are, in tournament games, extra factors other than the moves on the board that do impact the human that you are playing against. And that if you're aware of your psychological strengths and weaknesses, you can gain practical advantages against your opponents. I also learned that it can be worthwhile to put yourself in a vulnerable and even an objectively worse position, if doing so puts your opponent into a psychological state of mind that you can then exploit. I'm also now more focused than I was before, so that next year I'm going to be well placed to make one last stab at success in this competition. I hope you will follow me for the remaining round of the current tournament, and that you'll follow me with my preparation over the next 9 months or so before the 2023 Club Championship next year. Until next week, take care of yourselves and others, and I look forward to seeing you next week.